Welcome to Cool Talk. In our last video, we examined history from the Big Bang to the dawn of man 200,000 years ago in North Africa. Now, the Earth has suffered many ice ages. And how do we know this? Geology. The ice sheets move and push rocks. When they melt, they leave rocks behind as a record. Now, today we're still going through the last ice age. And how is that? Well, an ice age doesn't end as long as there's a permanent ice sheet that still exists, and the Antarctic ice sheet is still there. So by definition, we are still in the ongoing ice age. But what we're going through right now is an interglacial period, an interval of warmer temperatures. Early man learned to cooperate. Band together, they learned to use tools made of bones, skin, rocks, antlers. They were hunter-gatherers, and as populations grew, clans developed. And so did the clan leaders. For about 130,000 years, they survived, and when temperatures rose, they adapted. Around 70,000 BCE, populations moved to South Africa, and others crossed over to Asia. Now, early man began to use fire, and with fire came more weaponry, better tools, possibilities of night travels, protection against wild beasts, cave living, and cave art. Oral history by the campfire, more leisure time. We grew to respect the fire, the sun, and the moon, and animals. This respect turned to worship, and so different religions were formed. About 50,000 BCE, we crossed over to Australia, either through primitive boats or by then existing land bridges. And over the next 10,000 years, man spread over Africa, Asia, and by 40,000 BCE, they had entered Europe. Now, man's hunting skills improved, and they were able to hunt big game, such as the mammoth. This is a model of a hut found in Czechoslovakia, dated 25,000 years ago. Mammoth tusks were used to hold up the roof. The population of mammoth dwindled, and they crossed the Bering Strait, a land bridge that existed at the time between Siberia and West Alaska. They entered into the Americas. This land bridge is commonly called the Beringia. Now, many of you know of early man's crossing the Beringia into Alaska, but we don't know exactly when. Thick ice sheets probably hide many clues, but probably about 15,000 BCE. Man crosses into the Beringia. It was the first migration. They probably followed the mammoth and other big game such as the mastodon and the bison antiquus. A people developed. They were called the Clovis people, and they hunted the mammoth, the mastodon, and the saber-toothed cats into extinction. Now, there were several migrations into the Americas, and they've quickly spread south. And some of these migrations apparently came from the sea and from different directions. But in all essence, the Clovis people are the ancestors of all indigenous people. Archaeologists are still finding things out about the Clovis, but one thing is for sure, that the mammoth and the mastodon and the saber-toothed cat had no chance against this extensive hunting that was carried out. Meanwhile, in Europe and Asia, man had domesticated the dog. Not this animal right here. This is an ancestor of the dog. It's an animal that has gone extinct, but no, the actual dog. Probably one of the first animals to have been domesticated. In Mesopotamia, around the same time, the sheep was domesticated. And this is the Temple Göbekli in Turkey. It's actually the ruins of the oldest surviving temple, about 10,000 BCE. And by this point in time, all the racial groups that exist today had been formed by climate and geography. In the Americas, the Clovis culture declined and the Folsom culture flourished. Later on came the Plano culture that took its place. Now, all of this took place between 8,500 to 6,000 BCE. We refer to these natives as the Paleo-Indians. By this point, many of the big game had gone extinct, and they began to chase after a smaller bison, the American buffalo. Then another group had also entered the Americas via the Beringia. the na-dene. And the na-dene are ancestors of the future tribes, the Apache and the Navajo. By now, most of the world had been populated. Hunter-gatherers went out to get the food. Women would gather grains to make bread. Men would hunt. Religions were formed. Now, much of civilized history that we know of this time takes place predominantly in areas of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. But obviously, smaller groups spread elsewhere and had done their own history. But most of the advances would take place in the area mentioned. In a land around today's Syria, women learned how to plant food, and the agricultural revolution had begun. Everything changed. This quickly spread all over the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Man stopped being a nomad and could now settle in one spot. And after so many millenniums of wandering around, man began to build the first settlements. Food could be secured, survival almost a guarantee, as long as disastrous weather didn't strike. So man needed to study weather patterns and the seasons and the floods. In short, study the stars and the planets, and a way to measure time. And as the settlements grew, the populations grew. There were more clans and more clan leaders and more disputes. And then came warfare, as man discovered an until then unknown concept: private property. This didn't happen all at once. Europe was still cultivating peas while agriculture was popping up all over the Middle East. New settlements came up around the Nile River and the Congo River in West Central Africa. But Sumer and Egypt grew very, very fast. As the populations grew, the need for record keeping and communication and research created a need for writing. And now, for the first time, man could keep things on record and then pass it on. And with advances in mathematics and astronomy, it's no wonder that Sumer and Egypt grew so large and so prosperous. Between Egypt and Asia came a clan called the Natufians. They learned how to store grain and then build one of the first cities, a walled city and important trade post, Jericho. And then more cities sprang up between the Tigris and Euphrates River. Meanwhile, in 5800 BCE in Chile and Peru, the Chinchorro people were mummifying the dead. And farming began by this point in the Indus Valley, in what is today's Pakistan. Around 4000 BCE began a new migration across Beringia, the Inuits. And they stopped along Alaska and Canada. They learned to adapt to the very cold, harsh weather. They are still there today. By this point in the Americas, temperatures had risen and new deserts formed in North America. Ocean levels rose, glaciers retreated, and the Great Lakes depressions were filled with water. The Native American tribes and nations began to hunt for smaller game, and trade networks would form among the tribal nations. Meanwhile, the Egyptians had made advances in making music. They created flutes and the harps. Egyptians used copper. They made the plow, the rake. They learned how to fertilize with manure, very important. They produced linen and the potter's wheel. Farming began in Croatia and quickly spread all over Europe. And from the island of Crete came many, many ships that would predominate all over the Mediterranean. In China, silk was developed, and soon came the silk trade, as the Chinese traded with pretty much everybody. Look at this map right over here of the Silk Road, and can you imagine the exchange of culture and technology that took place? And very soon came advances in masonry. Now, the following events took place between 3000 to 2501 BCE. Upper and Lower Egypt was united under the first pharaoh, Pharaoh Menes. He would govern for 62 years and advance the worship of the gods. And the Egyptians invented the metal mirror. Now, can you imagine that all this time in history, to see your reflection, you had to go to a nearby lake or river? Otherwise, you didn't even know what you looked like. Egyptians made a new calendar with 365 days. They had glass beads and the first pyramids in Djoser and Giza. And when Egypt got tired of being attacked by Palestinians along the trade route, Egypt invades Palestine. And in China, a musician named Ling Lun made the first bamboo flutes and also made the Chinese five-tone musical scale, somewhat identical to our do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, di, do. Semitic people began to occupy Assyria, and the Sumerians used oil-burning lamps and were the first to use coin as legal tender. And around the lakes in Middle Europe, they began to weave loom and continue their farming and building settlements. They were early Trojan culture, and the Phoenicians settled along the Syrian coast. In England, the Stonehenge temple was built as the Danubian culture was at its height in Europe. In Sumer, King Gilgamesh arose, and theocracy would dwindle as monarchy would grow. And in China, many walled cities were created, several kingdoms. And the first South American cities with temples would develop in Peru. More advances in Egypt. The first libraries were formed. It was a time of the Egyptian cults of Isis and Osiris, and it was the birth of papyri, which they used somewhat a form of paper. Egypt began to import gold from Africa. They founded the city of Memphis, and it was the time of the earliest Egyptian mummies. Now, the Hyksos invaded Egypt, but Mentuhotep II would reunite them. In Sumer, Abraham left the city of Ur. There were many dynasties at the time in China, such as the Yao and the Shun, but a man named Yu became king not by inheritance. He didn't inherit the title. He was an expert at controlling the floods, and on pure merit, he became the first king of the Shia dynasty. For about 100 years, there was war in the city-states of Sumer between Uruk and Lagash and Kish. And finally, an Akkadian king named Sargon came in, took over, and conquered Sumer. The Babylonians domesticated the chicken. We're still learning about cities of civilizations in India, such as the Harappan and the Mohenjo-Daro, great trade cities that traded with Sumer at the time. They were advanced, they had plumbing and writing. Cotton was being cultivated in Peru, and in Crete, the Minoan culture was flourishing. Migrations that went into South Africa brought us the Bantu people. And in England, a great learning center was built nearby the Temple of Stonehenge. It was a time of the Bronze Age. Trade routes sprung all over Europe as Teutonic settlements surged up in Norway. Now, Mycenae was a Greek-centered civilization that came and went. And in Denmark, we had the first trumpets. In Babylon, under the reign of King Marduk, geometry would develop for astronomical measurements. Later on, King Hammurabi would unite Babylon, and from him came the Hammurabi Legal Code, laws pertaining to crime and also conduct, very influential. In North America, maize, beans, and squash were being cultivated. At the same time, trade networks would extend all over South America. In Egypt, contraceptives were being used and the Book of the Dead. By this time, we already had vehicles that were powered by horses. And despite some foreign invasions, Egypt came to be at the height of its power. And the Hittites became very powerful. They were an Indo-European tribe. They united and invaded and plundered Babylon and then attacked Syria. And in China, the Huang Ho culture would flourish. Because the rivers in the Indus Valley had been altered, trade routes began to dwindle. And in studying tree rings at the time, we see that several years of global cooling had happened, perhaps due to volcanic eruptions. The oldest known settlement in Mexico, Chiapa de Carso, and in Egypt, the last great pharaoh before Egypt began its decline, Ramses the Great. Under him, well, there were more emphasis on worshiping several gods. There were advances in medicine using rational thought instead of magic. There was a use of obelisks as sundials and the water clock. Moses introduced Mosaic law, a tremendous influence even today on law, philosophy, and the major religions. While the Iron Age began elsewhere, in Vietnam and Thailand, they were working with bronze. And then evidence came up of the Trojan War, and the Epic of Gilgamesh was written. In India, the Vedic religions assigned power to deities. A nomadic people from Central Asia migrated to India and brought a language with them, Sanskrit, which is an ancestor to the Hindi and Urdu languages of today. And in India and Egypt arose a new disease, leprosy. The Celtic culture would spread in the Danube region of Europe. And in Mexico, the Olmec culture was spread across Central America, greatly influencing the future Mayans. In China, we would have the first Chinese dictionary, and the Chinese also invented the compass. The only difference, though, is that the Chinese compass, points south. The Phoenicians would reach Malta. Athens would show the birth of a beginning of a democracy, and in Crete, the Mycenaean culture would bloom. And over in Africa, Ethiopia would become an independent power, and the Assyrian Empire would conquer Babylon. And we're going to stop the video right here for the moment. In my next video, we're going to continue with the final millennium before the Common Era. Now, a lot of the things that I mentioned here are spoken about with more detail, so I invite you to see my other videos on Sumer, Egypt, Africa, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Incas, China, India, and Christianity for more details that I breezed over right here. And after my next video about the final millennium, we're going to talk about the Native Americans of North America. In the meantime, give me your comments below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.